FiiO reckons that their BTR5 can give you high quality audio for your earphones or for your headphones, either wired or wireless, say from your smartphone or from your computer, and all this for only $129. But can it? FiiO sent me one to check out. This thing is tiny. I mean, it's the size of a couple of my fingers. I mean, you'll probably be a little bit more bulky once you put it in its case. I'll put it in its case in a bit. But it's small. And it's quite well featured. It has USB-C, which everyone seems to ask for these days. And it has balanced and single-ended outputs. That's 2.5mm and 3.5mm. I'd say balanced is unnecessary, but we'll talk about that in a bit. There's your microphone, so as you're using it as a Bluetooth device, you have a microphone, so you can use it to, if you're using it with a phone, you can take and receive calls, no problem. Your power button, your play or equivalent button, and forward and back or volume up and down, depending on the setup. Now, it's a very simple device functionally if you're not using the FiiO app. Now, if you're using the FiiO app, you can set all this stuff up in more detail, but you can adjust the digital filter. You can adjust the EQ, and you've got the preset EQs in there. I'll show you that in the app in a bit. You can dim the display. You can, if I can actually press it correctly, you can actually switch on USB 2 or USB 1 audio if it's necessary for whatever reason. You can switch on car mode, which it will power on automatically if it receives power through USB. And whether you want charging on or off, if you're using it with a phone via USB, you can switch off charging so you don't drain your phone's battery, for example, and gain high and low. And we're using version 1.6 of the firmware, which is the latest version as of this video. So that is the basic setup. Now it's connected via LDAC to an M11. And actually I'll show you that, because if you go into your settings and you have a thing called Bluetooth device control, this could be on your phone or on I'm just using a DAP because it's convenient to do so. And once you're connected to the BTR5, you have a variety of options you can switch on and off. Now, you can, as you saw, you can have charging on or off, depending if you want to drain your phone or whatever, the battery of whatever is connected. You can also have it, say you want to have charging off until device restarts. So for example, you plug it in, switch this off, plug it into your phone, and then the next time you unplug it and plug it in again, with turn the power on, off and on, then you can have charging automatically restart. Very handy. Car mode, we've already seen we can switch that on and off here. Idle, power off, self-explanatory. Bluetooth codec, you can disable Bluetooth codecs as necessary. Now, why would you want to disable a Bluetooth codec? Well, let's say that LDAC is unreliable from your phone. You can actually just switch that off so that you could have it not use LDAC and maybe force it to use aptX HD, for example. The other one you might want to force is aptX LL, low latency. Now, normally Bluetooth has a couple of hundred milliseconds latency, which means say you're watching a movie and you're watching someone's mouth move, there'll be a very slight and sometimes slightly irritating delay. And you can actually, low latency, if your device can transmit using low latency, will have basically a shorter delay. I think it's 40 milliseconds, and that will be more pleasant. So you can actually force it to use low latency where that is available, although it usually engages automatically. So something to consider depending on if you're watching, especially if you're watching a movie, for example, or playing a game. Now down to input priority is a very useful one. Let's say you are connecting it via USB. You can have it not automatically. It'll either switch to a USB DAC once USB is plugged in. So we saw here, for example, I have it here, it's LDAC, and I plug in USB, then it automatically goes to USB mode. You might not want it to do that for some reason. You can switch Bluetooth to priority instead. Menu operation, I held the button to get the menu operation. I could have it set as double click instead. LCD power off time, I've set to 30 seconds. And now that's only just the main settings. Next, the EQ, You can actually preset an EQ, then pull that EQ up in here as one of the presets if you use the user one. Otherwise, it just has your usual selection: pop, rock, dance, R&B, etc., classical or whatever. If you this EQ is the same as what you see in like the FiiO app in general. So if you want to investigate that, just check that app out. Here's an interesting one in the audio output. It's the estimated output. Now, if you put in, say, this is what I've put in here is roughly equivalent to a standard pair of headphones, 32 ohms and 102 decibels per milliwatt. Now, that will show you, depending on the volume, and will actually control the volume, which you'll probably see if it's going to pop up on screen. If I control the volume now, it'll actually tell you how much power output you'll be using. So even maximized with these regular headphones, you get 120 decibels, which is very bad for your hearing and destroy your hearing, and 1.7 millivolts of output, 1.7 volts essentially, which is almost line level. And the power out will be 90 milliwatts, which is, you could actually get that out, probably get that out of the single-ended output. So it means it has quite a bit of power in there to drive headphones, and it's way, way, way too loud for, for IEMs. It's got minuscule amount of power output necessary to even get 100 decibels. These, if I put the sensitivity of these in there, they're like way higher, and it will, I had the volume way down for listening with them. So actually, you don't need it. Actually, it shows how little power you need to get to a good, decent listening volume. The other useful thing I think is excellent. Now, something very irritating that can happen is you get a call, while you're listening to music, and the call comes through and blasts your ears out because you've just been listening to classical, which you need to turn the volume right up. Well, you can lock the volume of tones, or there's a maximum of 35 rather than 80, and the volume of calls you can lower down as well. So if you're listening, so you can actually have them quieter or louder as required. So that's worth fiddling around with before you take it out on the go. And testing, especially if you say use Skype or something like that, like I do, or line call, you can just make sure the volume is correct. Low pass filter I'm going to do last. We'll just go through the others. Channel balance, self-explanatory. Distortion compensation I played with, and I didn't notice a significant difference. This is interesting, and I haven't really looked into it. And apparently you can compensate for second harmonic compensation and third harmonic compensation. I'm not quite sure what that does, but I didn't really notice a huge difference. Second and third harmonics, you get, like with tube amps have even order harmonics. I don't know if that's related, but maybe worth checking out. I don't know guess it could be something that's built into the DAC in there. I don't know if it's something specific to FiiO. I haven't looked into it in a lot of detail because I didn't notice a difference too much when listening. The DAC clock divider level was an interesting thing, and it states that they recommend using 1/4 on Bluetooth and 1 on USB because the higher you set it, the more power it uses, and supposedly the sound quality increases. And I didn't notice, again, a significant difference. But I just preferred listening to get the maximum performance set at 1 and used it mostly with USB, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, lastly, we had the low-pass filter, in other words, the digital filter. Now, there are quite a few, and if you don't know about them, don't stress over them too much. More or less, this shows the result of putting an impulse response through them, and just to correct some misunderstanding that's on the internet. People talk about pre-ringing and post-ringing on these impulse responses. Those things don't exist in music. They don't happen. An impulse response is an illegal signal, in other words, a signal that is technically outside of bandwidth anyway, way outside. And so consequently, putting it through a digital filter gives you this pre- and post-ringing. So some people say pre- and post-ringing is bad, but it's actually, this is not a thing that's in music. It just tells you the kind of digital filter it is. So things like linear phase, fast roll-off filter, anything with like symmetrical will sound pretty much the same. But they do, it's set by default to this apodizing fast roll-off filter, type 1. And then I found that switching, while playing back music, it'll switch on the fly. Going to the type 2 and then hybrid, the music sounded very slightly kind of gentler, less sharp, and kind of smoother. And that was interesting. Brickwall is your standard technically accurate filter. Anyway, that was interesting because, something I'll talk about in the sound impressions. But I just want to finish up with the settings you have. And you have a lot of settings for a little device like this. You have also a full manual, operations manual. So if you forget anything about it, they've put the whole thing in here. Good on you. And it shows all the filter, all the menu options too, and what they all do and all the explanations. Now, the interesting thing, the only irritating thing about this app in this is that when I was in here, now you have help, and it does pop up. It has, like, say, explains everything. You tap on help. Tap. Come on. And it didn't want to. There we go. And it will give you an explanation. Confirm. If I do this on my iPhone, which is recording this, it pops up for a couple of seconds and then disappears before you can read it all. It doesn't have a confirm button, so FiiO needs to fix that. Anyway, you want to know how the thing sounds. So I plugged it into it. Listened in IMs to these Andromeda MW10s, which is the latest limited edition Andromedas. And these are, of course, very high sensitivity and tend to extract hiss out of everything. Now, this has an output impedance of about 2 ohms. And there's a lot of hype online about, oh, you have to have super low output impedance, it has to be 0.1 ohms, blah, 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 damping factor, blah, blah, blah. Most of that's rubbish. Not rubbish as in is not true, but at 2 ohms, one of the things that people don't talk about is that if you have a very, very, very low output impedance, then your hiss will be higher. And with something like these, a very low output impedance, these will pick up hiss like nobody's business. And at 2 ohms, it has, when we looked at the M11 review, which has a very low output impedance, and we went to the M11 Pro, which has about 2.5 ohms output impedance, the amount of hiss was considerably lower from the Andromeda MW10s. Now, these are kind of unicorn. I mean, the Andromedas are kind of a one, there aren't that many super sensitive IEMs out there, and most of them are super expensive anyway. But the 2 ohm output impedance doesn't really harm this. What I think does harm this is the balanced output. Now, the balanced output has way more power. It actually has individual DAC chips for each output. Now, let's say you're buying a $139 device, then you go, oh, but you have to spend all this money on getting you just bought some IEMs, maybe you spend, $100 and something on IEMs, maybe you've bought those Shozy IEMs I reviewed not too long ago, and then you have to buy an aftermarket cable on top of that so you can use the balanced output. That's silly. They should have cut the balanced output and just stuck with a good single-ended output and made this high power. That would have been far better. Because, as I said, why buy a bargain item to have to spend more money to actually use it? That's nuts. Now, that being said, it sounded better than the M5. That was distinct, even out of the single-ended output. It sounded quite decent. It was a little bit, I'd say, kind of excited sounding, a little bit lively. It was maybe, I think, only in comparison, maybe you could argue a little bit, maybe a very slight touch harsh. I mean, anything like serious, like the M11 Pro, sounded way more kind of competent, open, relaxed, easy to listen to. Whereas this was kind of a little bit more excited, a little bit less clear than, higher end gear. But generally, like if you're just ignoring all higher end gear for the moment, it sounded pretty good. And it drove even, as you could see from this tech specs, it drove even fairly straightforward headphones actually pretty well. IEMs, it drove, actually was very listenable with these MW10s, which very much pick up the quality of components. And I listen to a lot of acoustic music, and I can really hear whether it sounds, realistic or not, or harsh. One of the IEMs I did try with the BTR5 was FiiO's own FH7s, which I have reviewed, so you can check out my review of those. And they are, they're not quite as refined as the Andromedas, especially in the treble, but with a bit of a cable swap so I could get balanced output. I wanted to test if the single-ended and balanced output, would you notice anything, especially in the bass, and these have dynamic drivers, so that's more likely to show up any kind of issues in drive in the bass. But I found it kind of being much of a muchness, apart from the fact that the balanced output had a higher volume output. So if you're switching directly, you're going to get, a higher volume, and you have to kind of matching them is a little bit more tricky. But with a few steps down on the volume, you get about the same level, and it kind of, without, again, going too loud, as I don't listen too loud, it was kind of much of a muchness, and that was pretty good. Interesting to compare the same music, and one of my patrons suggested a track called Showbiz Kids by Ricky Lee Jones, which is a cover of a Steely Dan track, and that actually has a good kind of punchy bass in there, and I tried it with the good old M11 Pro. You can see my fingerprints all over it, and that, which you can actually see at the top here, that was a little bit, again, still a bit more refinement coming out of the M11 Pro, but less of a noticeable difference compared with the Andromedas, where there was a very noticeable difference. So I'd probably say that there's a kind of point where how far can you go with, say, say IMs when you're using it with a particular product before the differences start, the difference in increase in quality becomes less noticeable. And consequently, the reverse with a particular pair of IMs, how far up the ladder of expensive, say, DAPs or the like, can you go before you stop noticing an increase in sound quality? And so in that, I'd say if you're going, with the BTR5, they did a really good job, and the bass came through really nicely through the dynamic drivers of these IEMs. I only wish the treble was a bit more refined in these ones, but all the same, it was actually a really good match even with a single-ended output. That being said, it was interesting. I played around with the thought that if you plug it in via USB, so we hook it up here this is connected to a MacBook Air, which is just off screen, and now, an interesting thing is with components, if you disconnect the power to a laptop, and there's nothing else plugged into any ground source, then noise will not be transmitted through the USB ground line. And I did that just experimentally. I listened and then unplugged the power supply and plugged it back in, to listen. And it's very slightly more kind of sharper sounding with the power plugged in. Now, Apple power supplies tend to be fairly low noise anyway, so it's kind of not of a major issue. But that kind of more lively sound is probably the result of a bit more noise coming through. So that's an interesting factor. But this comes back to what I said about the digital filters. If I selected one other than the stock apodizing, anything that's kind of got which does not show a symmetric waveform when you put an impulse response through, then the sound became slightly softer, slightly more rounded, and slightly smoother and slightly easier to listen with. So let's say you're using just aptX, and maybe you're listening to music which is very kind of a little bit sharp for some reason, and maybe it's a little bit unpleasant for whatever reason. Then if you select one of the less accurate filters, it kind of will roll things off a little bit, be a bit smoother, and a bit easier to listen with. And, these are filters, if I was to do a blind test between them, obviously I would not pass a blind test because the differences are so subtle. But if you're listening for hours and hours and hours, you will notice because, if you're fatigued in any way in listening, and I don't think this is a fatiguing device even with the most accurate settings, then you'll appreciate it. It's nothing to do with blind test, whether you can pass a blind test or not. It's like if you're something you're listening for a long period with, you're going to appreciate these very subtle differences. So that was my impression of, that was my thought on the sound. But otherwise, the sound quality from this was pretty excellent. Again, not super detailed, but it was very easy to listen with and very enjoyable to listen with. It's such a little neat device. And, it's something you can stick in its case, actually upside down even. It'll go either way into its case, and that was technically upside down. So you could actually have it clipped up upside down and lift it up. But it clips in, makes it somewhat bigger. And as a general device, it's actually extremely competent and pretty good sounding. And, I could use it. Now, I'm fairly picky. I have a lot of high-end gear here. I'm fairly picky about my sound, but I actually found myself plugging these in and listening for quite a while and enjoying it, which is kind of the real test. And so I think they've done a really competent job. It's even with full-sized headphones you can do, it does a competent job. As long as you don't try and blast your ears out, and I always caution, don't try and listen too loud. You will hurt your ear. If you damage your hearing, you cannot recover it. If you want to test your hearing, get one of those kind of sound level testing apps, and then once you've got the music at the level you listen to, put your earphones right up against the microphone of the phone, and then see how loud you're listening. You'll probably find you're listening louder than you think. At the volumes, even my moderate listening level at 70 to 80 dBs, if I turn my speakers up to that level, it sounds really loud. So to think it's very easy to damage your hearing with headphones or earphones. But with better, good quality gear, you feel you don't need to turn the volume up as much. At least that's my experience. So, BTR5. Really nice, I think really nice effort from FiiO. For under $150, they've done a really good job. And I wasn't expecting much at that kind of price, and actually I think it did better than I expected.